Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's meeting of Hammersmith and Fulham Council's Audit Committee. I'm Councillor Ian Cassidy, the Chair of the Audit Committee, and we are being held as a hybrid meeting, but obviously, as we all know, only those committee members attending in person will be able to discuss and vote on decision items. As always, just to remind everybody, we are being joined remotely by viewers on YouTube. So obviously be aware that you are being beamed to the public when you're speaking. As always, usual housekeeping for remote meetings, just make sure your microphone's muted unless you're speaking so there's no feedback. And officers, if you're able to, and any guests, if you're able to introduce yourself and say who you are when you first speak, just for the purposes of any members joining us at home. And if we just go through introductions, as I said, I'm Councillor Cassidy, I'm the Chair of the committee. Councillor Carmel.
Hello, good evening. My name is Alex Carmel and I am a Councillor for Munster Ward.
And Councillor Ree.
Councillor Rowan Ree from Askew Ward.
And moving swiftly on to the first item, which is apologies for absence. We have apologies for absence from Councillor Matt Thorley and Councillor Alexandra Sanderson, and apologies for lateness from Councillor Caleb Landy, who should be joining us shortly. And then moving on to the second item, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Shakes of the head, so I think we're okay there. And then item number 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Do we have any questions? Or are we happy to approve? Councillor Carmel.
Yes, Chair. On page 7 of the report, in paragraph 3, we were informed on my questioning about cybersecurity that there would be a report at the next meeting. I may have misread the agenda and it was very long, so I could have missed it, but I don't appear to see the report on cybersecurity. And could I have an explanation, please?
Okay, I don't know if we have any comment from any of the officers on that. I'm not sure. Would that have been David?
So apologies, Chair, that wasn't picked up as part of the actions. I will make sure there's a report to the next committee on that matter. Apologies for that.
Okay, if we just make sure that that's definitely noted and definitely coming through, maybe send an update just to confirm that that's coming through to everyone. Do we have any other questions, or are we okay? Happy to approve? Excellent. So if we want to move on to the first substantive item of the agenda, which is item number 4, the statement of accounts. And I'll call on Emily Hill to introduce, but we're also joined by Paul Dossett from Grant Thornton as well. Emily.
Thank you, Chair. Emily Hill, Director of Finance. In front of the committee today is the always very large pack of papers which constitute our statement of accounts, which includes our pension fund accounts. As well as that, it includes Grant Thornton's audit findings report, which is a summary of the findings of the external audit of those statements, and also the management representation letter, which is a letter that I will sign along with yourself, Chair, to provide Grant Thornton with assurances before they provide the opinion. As you said, we have Paul here today who will be able to highlight some of the key findings from the audit. I think probably I will just highlight briefly that whilst this committee is very used to getting the statement of accounts, this is the statement of accounts for 2021. So that's the year ended 31st of March 21. So almost this time last year. So it's a very unusual set of statements. This was the first year of COVID. And so whilst it's very usual to look at one year's figures compared to the next, you will see this year a large number of variances, both in income, expenditure, in grants and on the collection fund. And that's almost entirely attributable to COVID and the impact of COVID on the council's finances. Happy to answer any questions that you might have on the statements, but I thought it was important to pull out that this really is an exceptional year in terms of the statements because of those specific transactions. In relation to the pension fund committee has already reviewed and also approved those statements and the annual report, but again, happy to answer any further questions that you might have. That being said, it is such a large document with a lot of detail in it. I'll perhaps sort of leave my summary at that, hand over to Paul, but of course I'll be available to answer any questions the committee may have.
That's great, thank you very much. Paul, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm Paul Dossett. I'm the partner from Grant Thornton, the external auditors. And our report starts on page 147 of your pack. I guess by way of context, members will recall that the 1920 audit was delayed somewhat, mainly due to a sort of technical issue involving the pension fund, where we had to consider the impact of a qualification on one of the funds, and that was quite a difficult technical issue. We had lots of discussions with the council about that, and technical advice and all sorts of other things. And eventually it managed to resolve that with appropriate disclosures and reporting from us. And that resulted in us signing the 1920 accounts off in July of 2021. So we moved on to the 2021 accounts in October in terms of planning and commencing that piece of work. And as Emily said, the year very much marked by it being the COVID year, so quite a lot of additional work on our part, as well as obviously the council's part in preparing the accounts, specifically related to COVID and the impact on valuations and the various quite complicated grants regime that the government put in place, which got more complicated as 2021 went on. So this report sets out where we are on that audit. And if I take you to page 148, which is the sort of headlines of where we are. So we have completed the majority of our work. The pension fund work is complete. The technical issue that sort of delayed things last year still remains as an issue, but because we resolved the disclosures and the reporting arrangements on that, it hasn't caused a specific delay this year. And so in terms of the council audit itself, we identified a couple of errors in terms of that needed adjustments to the accounts, not adjustments to the general funds, just adjustments to the statutory comprehensive and income and expenditure statement. So not matters of concern in the sense of impacting on sort of council taxpayers. And in terms of where we are at the moment, we have we sort of whittled it down to some queries we have on debtors and creditors. So we've dealt with what I would call the big ticket areas for in terms of what audit looks like these days, in terms of the pension fund liability assets. All those things are dealt with. We're just sort of down to these last points on debtors and creditors. And there's just as on top of that, and this is not a Hammersmith and Fulham specific issue, we've just had an issue that's emerged in the sector in the last couple of months, relates to accounting for infrastructure assets. And for members not familiar with the detail of that, basically the way that councils account for infrastructure assets, bridges, roads, etc., are at historic cost basis. So relatively straightforward because it doesn't require any separate valuation. But what's been identified in the sector is some councils have not been keeping particularly good records when the components have been replaced. So what they've tended to be doing is taking last year's figure, spending some capital sums on the roads or bridges or whatever, and then not using that, not replacing that, and not impairing that, and not writing that down. So there's a risk that there's a significant overstatement of the gross value of infrastructure assets. So this is an issue that's sort of relatively recently come up. We've written to the council today with some sort of queries for the council to answer. I think it's fair to say that because this would be a worse issue if you were county council, because they've got a huge road infrastructure. Obviously, some of your road infrastructures, a lot of it is not run by the council, so it may or may not be a tricky issue to deal with at the council level. But we need that issue resolved alongside these other two issues, or the debtors and creditors, to get to a final position. Going over to 149, value for money work, the National Audit Office have introduced a new code of practice requirement for value for money. It requires us to produce a much more detailed and holistic report, which will come to this committee in due course, and report specifically on financial sustainability, governance, and economy efficiency and effectiveness. This report basically is designed to identify whether there are any significant weaknesses, or whether there's any need for the auditors to take statutory action, as well as items of improvement. At this stage, the work is ongoing, but it's a requirement for us to flag up to you if there were any significant weaknesses we'd already identified. Pleased to say that we haven't. So the way that report is shaping up is it may have some improvement recommendations, but that's it. So they're the sort of lowest level of recommendations. So effectively, it will end in a pretty good place. So I think probably actually I will probably stop there, because the rest of it was quite a lot of detail and sort of technical points, which I'm happy to answer questions on. But as a summary, the audit is near to completion, but we have some issues that are specific to the council to relate to deal with, infrastructure issue to deal with as well. So happy to stop there, Chair, and obviously take questions that members have.
Thank you very much. That's been really helpful. Just one or two things myself. I noticed sort of in your headlines section, first of all, just mentioned delays in obtaining information from the council. Is that an issue specific to Hammersmith and Fulham, or is that something you were finding generally because of COVID and working from home, etc.?
I think it's an issue we've found everywhere. I think it is to do with, at least partly to do with the working arrangements that have been in place over the past couple of years. I think it's fair to say we're working slower than we were before as well. Auditing remotely is not easy for anyone, council officers included, of course. So the delays have not been excessive. We're certainly experiencing much longer delays, other audits that started significantly before this audit. We have plenty of audits that started in June that are still going on. And so the delays here, I'd say, were in relative terms quite minor, just in some specific areas. They're not issues, for example, there are issues we've noted, but not issues of significant concern.
No, thanks for that. Similarly, I noticed, I think on page 149, or our page 149, you mentioned in terms of value for money arrangements, obtaining access to the pension admin system hosted by Surrey County Council. I think those of us on the pension committee have chatted excessively about Surrey County Council. Has that now been resolved? You have the information you required? Is all well with that?
Yes, indeed. Obviously, members are fully aware of the challenges with that arrangement. Those challenges played out for us as well. But yeah, it has been resolved.
Happy. Do we have any questions from committee members? Councillor Carmel.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A couple of points, if I make. We as a committee fully appreciate the difficulties that the pandemic has caused, not only on your side, but also on the council side. Would you agree that it is not ideal to do an audit remotely, and there are assurance steps, for want of a better word, that would normally be done in person that have not been able to have been done because of the remote nature of the audit. And as a result, and this is prevalent throughout the country, would you agree it is fair that one must exercise a very small note of caution as to the robustness of the procedures that you've carried out, but there is no blame attached to you?
I think it's fair to say that, yeah, doing an audit entirely remotely is not the best thing to do. In fact, for 21-22, and notwithstanding any other changes that might come as a result of COVID, it is our intention to work with audited bodies in the most appropriate way, which would include on-site presence, will include obviously also working in our office. And clearly we will need to agree, particularly with the council and officers, about what that looks like. So it won't be just a return to what it always was. It will be about agreeing with the council. For example, we might agree that for a 2-week period, it works for particular officers to be with auditors going through stuff. I think it's much more efficient to do it that way. And I think it also does play to your point that there would be concerns, I think, if any audited body refused totally to allow auditors on site in all circumstances, because that would give us some concerns. In terms of the robustness of audits in 1920, for example, which was the first year where audits were done remotely, the only sort of external judgment that I can bring to play in that is the reviews of regulators who reviewed the files that we carried out for 1920 audits, which are the FRC that do the large audits, and the QAD, part of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, that do the smaller audits. Now, for 1920, based on their assessment, we got quite good results about the robustness of our audit and our audit files. Now, that's just one way of measuring it, but they seem to be reasonably satisfied with what we were doing. So whilst there is always a risk that not being present and not being able to have those face-to-face discussions does present a risk that things are in some way hidden, or auditors might not observe things that they might observe if they were on site, that is a risk. I'm confident that the audits have been robust in the last 2-year period, but I'm not confident. I'm certainly certain they have been much slower than they would have been otherwise. So I would welcome a return to appropriate on-site presence. I think that would be the best way to carry out an audit, and obviously we'll agree that appropriately with the council when the time comes.
Before my second point, a follow-up, if I may. I do seem to remember from a previous year, some time ago, where the council had approved the statement of accounts, and then there was a subsequent discovery of an error in it. Are there sufficient leeways due to the COVID regulations, as and when you get back into the building, to restate the statement of accounts once we've approved it, if, and I stress if, there is discovered a minor or technical or even a major error in the what may be the approved statement of accounts?
Thank you. No, well, it will depend if the audit is certified or not, I think. There's an audit opinion, but there's also an audit certification process which closes the audit off to any further changes. But in general, I would suggest, or I would think that unless the error were material, we wouldn't be restating the financial statement. So of course we would need to the following year anyway. Had we found an error, we must restate a material error. We must restate the previous year and draw attention to that through a prior period adjustment. I certainly wouldn't expect us to ever identify a material error after the audit, but certainly the following year we would amend that.
I think Councillor Ree maybe wanted to come in on this point as well.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry, Councillor Carmel. I think it's a good question when I was planning on asking. So, as I understand it, you're saying that you're confident that it's you were able to do a sufficiently robust review. Due to the remote nature of the audit, is there anything that you wanted to check or verify that you haven't been able to? And would that affect your overall opinion?
No, there's been no restrictions on our audit procedures. I mean, there's sort of two types of procedures. One is the basic physical verification of assets, which is part of our role, which hasn't been restricted because obviously people have been able to travel and move about and do that and carry out other procedures. And in terms of how we audit invoices and things like that, I mean, that's the bit that's been quite time consuming because we have to do it through shared screens and things like that. And that does take a lot of time, but that hasn't been a concern. And in fact, to be fair, under new sort of auditing requirements, which are sort of auditing standards are constantly being strengthened, we have to be very, very clear about the source of documents. So we have to verify the source of documents, bank details, the ledger entries, journals. We have a very strong process for selecting journals and risk-based journals. So we've been able to do all of that, obviously based on the sort of support from officers to provide that information. So that has been a slow process because it just takes time to go through all of those things. But it has, rather than perhaps traditionally officers sort of pointed us to a bunch of invoices or something else, we've had to go for it one at a time with each. So we've selected a sample and we say invoice number 58, and then we share screens and look at it. So I don't think we don't have concerns about that process, but it is just very time.
So the process has been different, but you're confident it's as robust as
yes, indeed. And I mean, clearly we had some concerns at the start of the pandemic when we were having to sort of learn how are we going to do this remotely? Does it work remotely? Can we even do the audit? And I think there was once right at the start of the pandemic, there was SIPFA actually were considering a whole range of changes to the accounts. Just sort of reflect that auditing couldn't really be done properly, but that was rejected at the time, and we found a way to do it. And literally the only thing we haven't been able to do, which doesn't really impact on local government but did impact on the health service, was attend stock takes at the start of the pandemic, which led to some qualifications in the health service. Luckily, the local authorities never have material stock, so it's not an issue in the local authority world. But that's been the only restriction when we weren't able to attend physical stock takes that we've had.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Carmel.
Thank you. Yeah, Councillor.
Thank you. You adumbrated further points that I was likely to make, so I'm grateful to you. But one thing I did find interesting in your presentation to the committee, Mr. Dossett, was your reference to today's sorry, my screen's just gone dead. So to the valuation of infrastructure assets, and you in particular mentioned bridges, and I suspect it may not have escaped your notice, but there are potential huge capital costs with relation to a bridge that this council owns. And I wondered what the effect of your report today will have on the accounts, notwithstanding that despite promises to the contrary that the bridge would be fully repaired by last year and open to all traffic, but I'm not going to go there at this stage. What the potential effects on the accounts might be from the potential liability as yet unquantified that we face. I thought you might take this.
Thank you. As Paul's just said, infrastructure assets are valued at historic cost, so it's a relatively simple valuation methodology. So in terms of the actual statement of accounts itself, rather than a sort of funding issue, there's no risk to the statement of accounts. The liability, which in terms of whatever we may need to fix the bridge, isn't a liability in accounting terms, so it wouldn't be a liability at the 31st of March until it's a liability. It never becomes a liability. It's as we fix it, that expenditure will come onto the accounts. There have been decisions made by Cabinet in the past 6 months around decisions in relation to the stabilisation of the bridge. So that's a budget approval of 8 million. That works now, I believe, on site. And so that 8 million, as we spend that, will go onto the historic cost of the asset over the next year. And so will be reflected in the statements of accounts as we incur that expenditure.
Thank you very much. I've got a question from Councillor Caleb Landy.
Sorry.
No, thank you. I was looking at the table in your documents, page 30, action plan, audit of financial statements, and I did have some just questions around it. I found some of the actions just a little bit. I'd love just a little bit more detail around them. I think in particular the employer leaver forms and the fact that employees sometimes were getting paid more than they had because the leaving date hadn't been communicated, and then also some of the new system and some of the issues that we've had with debtors and creditors as well. I was wondering if you could, it says that there's an action plan that's been agreed. Is there an update that you can give us, Emily, in respect to some of those things? Because I just want to ensure that we are learning from this and actually applying some of the applying the auditor's recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor. You mentioned the two specifically, so I can answer those, but obviously happy to answer anything further on the others. So in terms of the debtors and creditors work, I think that's right, but there's a slightly different way that the IBC reports some of the control account debtors and creditor balances, and we have had discussions with the auditor this year that probably taking a different approach, both in us providing working papers and in auditing them, in auditing the balances as a whole balance of a control account rather than individual transactions between, will give more audit assurance and more assurance over the bigger numbers. So I think that's absolutely taken on board, and we're absolutely clear on the way that we can work together to do that in the future. So, and we expect to put that in place for the audit of 2021-22, so the financial year just ending. So I'm comfortable that we will have that action in place for this next audit. As to the employer leaver forms, we're doing a lot of work with IBC at the moment on what we're calling retrospective pay actions. So actions where people are amending pay or leavers after the date that they've left. So we do all that we can and do have systems in place to recover any overpayments where that happens. But of course, the best thing to do is to stop them happening in the first place. So we are doing a lot of work with IBC and also with our managers, because essentially it's managers that must input that information onto the system. We get data every month on retrospective pay actions, and TTI are following up with individual managers to make sure they understand their responsibilities and the implications of not doing so.
As a follow-up question, is there management training as well going on so that they're aware of the importance of getting this right?
So I think we've improved the employee induction process over the last couple of years, actually. So that will include specific managers actions for managers. So there'll be specific induction requirements for managers. Other than that, I think it's more of a targeted approach at the moment for the non-compliers, and there's sort of, I guess, on the job training. So rather than having a training course, the HR business partner will be sitting down with them, explaining what they need to do, how they need to process that on the system. Because the system's relatively intuitive, but if you're not doing this very often, then sometimes you can miss it or forget or miss a step. So the HR business partners would sit down with the managers to ensure they do understand the process.
Cool. And then I guess I just have one final question to the auditors themselves, which is, there were 5 action sort of recommendations here, which, you know, I'm by no means an expert, but felt a testament to the great job that, you know, our finance team have been doing. How many would you tend to find it how many would you normally have listed in a council's audit reports with recommendations like this? And are there any in particular that you're concerned about or have been coming up time and again that we should be watching and scrutinising carefully?
Thank you, Councillor. I think 5 is a pretty low number, especially for a large and complicated authority. These reports for the large councils will always have several recommendations. So I think it's a positive reflection on the sort of control environment and the issues we find from the audit and support we get from carrying out the audit. I mean, I think, in terms of the issues that we've raised, I mean, the starters, the employee leaver forms, whilst I'm in no way underplaying that, we get this issue virtually everywhere. I mean, it's just very common across public sector bodies, very common, probably across a lot of bodies, for the reasons that Emily has stated. So I wouldn't have put that one as a sort of high risk one from our point of view. I think in terms of those related to debtors and creditors and balances being transferred on legacy systems, I think it's important to get that right, because if it's not sort of managed effectively, you start to get balances that people don't know what they are, and over time that could build up into I suppose potential opportunities for fraud. I'm not suggesting there's any in this case, but it's an area of some risk. So I think that's an important area to focus on. But as I said, overall, to have a relatively small number of these types of recommendations, as well as a relatively small number of adjustments to the accounts, and quite frankly, one of those was just a timing difference rather than anything significant in terms of an error. It's pretty good. So yeah, I'd say we're pleased with the way the audit has gone. You know, the audit world at the moment is not easy to get stuff done. It has been challenging in overall terms, and remote working and things like that don't help. But actually, the council produces good accounts and good working papers overall, and gives us good support. So we're happy with that.
Thank you very much. I do have another question. Councillor Carmel.
Yes, thank you. A sort of tangential question to Councillor Caleb Landy, which one I had down, going back to the legacy balances. I note that your headline figure says that there is a high volume of legacy balances brought forward from the previous accounting system. Just so we know, are these high volumes, you know, a few pounds a piece, or are they significant sums? What is roughly, and I won't quote you on this, the value of the legacy balances? I mean, is it something that is a significant sum, or is it a minor accounting thing that includes, you know, various underpayments of a penny or overpayments of a penny?
Emily, I think.
Thank you. And Paul's absolutely right in that there is some more work to do, at least in sort of proving the totals. Just to be absolutely clear, we have reviewed a lot of those legacy balances, and a lot of those still remain current and correct, if you see what I mean. So we're not suggesting, or I don't believe in looking at it, that those legacy balances need writing off or are incorrect. It's just that we need to do some more work to agree the global sum, essentially.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Carmel.
Just as an anecdote, since it's before anybody else was around, I do recall in November 1993, the council appearing in the News of the Screws, as it then was, for chasing the son and heir of a former resident for 3p in poll tax, because the council system had no way of writing off a sum of that level. The computer said they owed 3p, and they spent something like 147 quid sending a threatening letter to get 3p underpayment of council tax back. So I do appreciate and understand that these legacy balances, can be pifflingly small, but you have to have robust systems, and you actually have to have a sense of discretion as to when you do it, and hard rules make for sometimes hard cases. So I, for one, remembering that story, do appreciate that legacy balances have a variety of causes.
Thank you very much. I think that was before all of our times. Councillor Ree, I think, has a question.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that the council's become more ruthlessly financially efficient since those days. I just want to start by congratulating Emily and your team. It seems like you've got a pretty clean bill of health from the audit. So I know how much work you guys are doing. So well done. I'm glad it's been recognised. Mr. Dossett, I was again pleased to hear that you say that there were no significant value for money weaknesses that you identified as part of the audit. On page 209, we've got a spot to drop in the audit letter for the value for money work. I suppose this is just a quick process question. Presumably this is going to be a fairly detailed letter setting out the work involved in assessing value for money. Is this something that the committee is going to have to review again before this audit takes place, or what's the process around that?
So the National Audit Office have effectively decoupled the value for money work from the opinion on the accounts. So their procedure is that the value for money work has to be issued prior, within 3 months of when the accounts are signed off. So the accounts have not yet been signed off, so that deadline hasn't yet come. But what would happen is the accounts will be signed off, the opinion will be given on the accounts, and then subsequently the value for money work report, which will be a substantive report, which will come to this committee. And the ambition also is to take that report to full council so that members are more broadly aware of the overall audit perspective. So it is a substantive report. It's a report that will be, roughly speaking, 30 pages long and contain quite a lot of detail. And at that point, the value for money bit will be closed, and then the certificate will be issued. At the moment, we have a problem nationally that the government's WGA process has, how can I put it politely, malfunctioned, and therefore we're not able to issue any certificates on any audits at the moment, even the ones that were signed some time ago, because we're still waiting for the WGA software, which is the sort of final part almost of the audit process, to be working functionally. And so we haven't issued a certificate on a single audit on 2021 as yet, as we await that certificate, even where we finished the value for money work and every other aspect of the audit.
Sorry, WGA, what's?
Whole of government accounts. The government collects data from the council and from the auditor to prepare the whole of government accounts, which are obviously presented to Parliament and sort of audited by the National Audit Office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have any other questions from councillors. Councillor Carmel, anything further? Or anybody else? In which case, well, I mean, thank you both to Emily and thank you to Paul for coming tonight and being able to answer questions so helpfully. Just again, this is a decision paper just for the purposes of the minutes and for anybody watching remotely. So the recommendations are to note the content of the external auditor's audit findings report, to approve the 2021 annual governance statement, to approve the 2021 managing representation letters, to approve the statement of accounts for 2021, including the pension fund accounts, to approve the pension fund annual report 2021, and to note that the accounts remain unaudited until final sign off by the external auditor. And finally, to delegate authority to the chair of the committee in consultation with the Director of Finance to approve any further adjustments to the various appendices which may be required as part of the completion of the audit work. So that was a mouthful. Councillor Carmel.
Thank you, Chair. Just to for the point of clarity, in the event that you undertake an action under, or your successor, as the case may be,
Yes.
Under recommendation 7, can we have an assurance that these will be reported back to a subsequent or the subsequent audit committee?
Yep, we're happy with that. Excellent. In which case, are we happy to approve all the recommendations? Agreed. Excellent.
Decision, I think we might need to take a roll call.
Oh, do we need to take a roll call? Okay, we're fine. Excellent.
Lovely. I shall use that at the next full council.
Thank you very much, Paul, for coming along this evening. And again, thanks to Emily for helping with that. In which case, we'll move on to the next item, which is item number 5, the internal audit progress report. And just to note, everybody, there's a few appendices, various, I think there's 3 limited assurance reports. And I think we have Moira to present. Moira, if you want to introduce yourself to the committee.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Moira Mackey and I'm the Head of Internal Audit, and I'm joined tonight by David Hughes, who is the Director for Internal Audit. This is our regular progress report. So you recall we came to the committee in December. We've completed quite a few audits since that time, 14. And as noted, there are 3 limited assurances in our report this time. I wouldn't be too concerned that there are 3. It's because we haven't had any limited assurances for some time. But you know, in the scheme of things, 90% of the audits completed year to date are actually positive assurance. So just to sort of put that into context for you. We've actually summarised the findings and recommendations from those audits in the Appendix 3 to the report. And we've also attached the reports for your review as well. Just to put another sort of bit of context to it, we do follow-up work, which is reported in here as well. And generally speaking, we have very good compliance with implementing of recommendations, which is reported in here. We are currently doing the follow-ups of the 3 limited assurance audits, so that the aim is that by the year end, we can demonstrate that any potential control weaknesses have been addressed, and that we, you know, you don't have to be overly concerned about them. I would also just say, you know, obviously we do a risk-based plan, so the chances are you will pick up some limited assurance work, and often these are in areas which directors have specifically asked us to look at because they want us to test what they've got in place and identify any areas for improvement. The final point I would make is that 2 of the 3 limited assurance audits were started actually in the last financial year, quite late, and they took a while to complete, a bit like the external audit. Sometimes these things aren't as easy to do remotely. and engaging with also with staff who were incredibly busy at the time because of COVID. So just to sort of put it into context, that some of these audits have moved on quite a long way since then, and hopefully you can see that in the management responses to the reports. We're also joined tonight by some representatives from the various departments whose audits we're reporting here as limited. That was all I was going to say.
If I could just pick up, Chair, on that last point and apologise. So I had discussions with the head teacher for Vanessa Nursery School and had agreed with her that she would attend this evening. And we've obviously got some narrative in the report which sets out the improvements the school have made. Unfortunately, due to communication mix-up, the invitation hadn't gone out. We've tried to rectify that while the meeting's been going on, but unfortunately not be able to do that. So I just wanted to apologise to you, Chair, and to the committee for not having sorted that out previously.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that, Moira, for giving that kind of brief highlight through the report. First thing, and a purely admin point, just a note in Appendix 6, the security resources management, there's quite a few bits and bobs that have been redacted. I just wanted to ask why.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I was going to mention that, but I thought you might raise it anyway. There were some references to specific companies in there, and also sites and shift patterns, which we didn't feel was appropriate to put out into the public domain.
I will say it is in the public domain because it's not been redacted properly. So this is really tedious computer technical geekery. If you copy and paste any of the text on the reports pack that's on the council's website, it's a PDF file. If you copy that text and paste it into Microsoft Word or Microsoft Notepad, you will see every single bit of the redacted data, as I did about 10 minutes ago. I don't know if there's a better way to redact things when they're online documents, but anybody could copy and paste anything.
I was quite concerned about that. And
everybody how to do it, but I know that's quite a common problem with redacted PDFs.
I mean, I did discuss this with legal services as well, because whether or not it should be in the open agenda or not, we felt it was fine. It was in the open agenda. We could all talk to David about how we can rectify that on the system. Yeah. And going forward, we'll try to make what's published on the open agenda more generic, so that we don't have those names in there.
No, that's fine. Thank you. No, it's quite a common problem. I mean, it's not just a council. I've encountered it quite a few times. It's a fairly well-known issue. In terms of the housing decants, it was just something I wanted to pick up a bit on that. Going back to, I think, what's page 414 on our page numbers. It was the KPI for decanted tenants returning to their property. Obviously, that's a fairly important KPI. That's about people getting back into their homes after work was being done. I mean, my understanding of that is that I'm assuming the KPI was not seen as appropriate for the decant service because they didn't have responsibility for whether the work was being done or not, or rather if it was being finished at time or not. In general, though, I mean, 18.75% seems extremely poor. I mean, I know that's obviously, as it points out, that's not necessarily the fault of the decant service. How's that going to be managed going forward, both in terms of measuring the KPI and also properly assigning responsibility for whether that's being fulfilled or not?
Glendine, are you able to help me on this one?
Yep, absolutely. Just to say that the Supported Moves team, the decant team, will continue to monitor the process and will continue to minimize any stay in decanted accommodation. So we are working very closely with the repair service. We also have a report that we update on a monthly basis, and we escalate that up to Mark Meehan and to John so that they have oversight of that. So we are monitoring that going forward and paying close attention to that.
So who does that KPI now fall under? I'm assuming not the decant service.
That's right. So it falls under the repair service, because it's the repair service who would be responsible for carrying out the work to ensure that the decanted tenant can return back to their property.
And what's now been done just to make, I mean, obviously as 18.75 is quite concerning, what's been done to get that back up?
It's part of the repairs improvement plan, and so we have a program in place. The service meets on a weekly basis now with the relevant members of the repair service, and that includes the chief executive as well. And so we are monitoring that very closely, and the decants is part of that process as well.
Okay, Councillor Carmel, I think, has a question.
Just purely on that, and just for my interest, and perhaps even the committee's interest, where there has to be an emergency decant of a block or two blocks, and I'm thinking specifically of Lannoy and Hartop, which involves the demolition of the building because they are declared unfit for human habitation, and the tenants who have to get decanted out of there are promised a return to the rebuilt property or properties that will be constructed several years down the line. Does this fall under this KPI, and is this a possible reason why the figure is so large, because it's distorted by the emergency move from Lannoy and Hartop?
No, that would fall outside of this process. The emergency moves from Lannoy and Hartop, they were considered permanent decants, however, with the option to return if residents wanted to. So when the development, it's a bit complex, because in other words, we will move someone to a new home, but if they want to return back to the new development, they can. And we will do that through a local lettings plan. So we'll put, once the new development has been completed, we put a local lettings plan. Yeah. And so that's for residents who either want to return, or residents who are on the housing register who live in that vicinity will have first refusal to return to those properties.
Thank you. I was just trying to work out why we had such a high figure, and I thought that was a possible explanation, but not as it seems, and I'm grateful for your answer.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have questions from any committee members. Councillor Ree.
Thank you very much. Just had a couple of questions about the Appendix 2, the internal audit plan for 21-22.
Oh. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry.
I just wanted to pick up on an issue that Councillor Carmel raised at the last meeting, and then again at the beginning of this meeting. There's an item here on ransomware, a review that's either in progress or due to start. My question, I suppose, was: has this review started? And if so, will it take into account the heightened cybersecurity risks that all organisations are now facing as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Obviously, Hammersmith and Fulham isn't a sort of a major aggressor of Russia, but obviously the government is warning all organisations that there is a heightened risk now of cyber attacks, presumably including ransomware. And is this something that will be considered as part of this review?
So I can confirm the ransomware audit is ongoing at the moment. It's I'd say midway through. So it should be completed in March, if not early April. I will have to pick up on that specific point, but I can't imagine it doesn't take into account the risk, the cyber risk, because of the nature of the audit. So I'm pretty sure that is covered in the scope, and all councils are very aware of that issue now, obviously.
Just to reassure you, Councillor Rees, I know that work has been done by the digital services team in light of the National Cybersecurity Centre's guidance that's come out to all local authorities to ensure that all arrangements in place are checked and are ensured to be up to date, so including patching of servers and so on. So there's a lot of work being done by digital services to make sure that's been robustly followed through over the last few weeks.
Excellent, thank you very much. I know the National Cybersecurity Centre has published a lot of guidance on this in recent days.
Indeed.
Just so that we can all be sure of that answer. Is it possible to add into the minutes that we will report back on that? I know you weren't quite sure what you said about the.
Yeah, I need to go and look at the scope and talk to the lead auditor on it just to see what.
Could we get an answer on that either in writing or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Indeed. And we'll also include for the report on cybersecurity to the next meeting, Councillor Reid, the issues you've raised there about the work that's been done in light of the NCSC guidance that's been issued over the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
On that point, I'm grateful to Councillor Ree, and as he might have guessed, I was planning to bring that up. But just so we can have assurance, and it's up to the discretion of the chair, because especially given his previous remark, might the chair be amenable to an exempt item on the agenda so we can actually be aware of what some of the details are that we're taking for cybersecurity? Because I'm not particularly keen on it, putting it in the open agenda, even if it's redacted properly or not. But as committee members know, this is something that I raise on a frequent and regular basis, and I really have considerable concerns. And I think, as we all know, what happened to a certain North London council, which is still, I believe, not fully recovered. I'm very keen that we do not suffer the same fate as that. So if necessary, and it would be appreciated, I would like a potentially exempt item on the agenda for the cybersecurity report.
If I may, Chair, just Councillor Carmel may recall that midway through last year, following the event in the other authority, we did bring an exempt paper to the committee exactly in those lines. So happy to pick that up with digital and governance colleagues to ensure that happens at the next meeting.
That's great. No, thank you very much for that. Councillor Ree has another question.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Carmel, we seem to be asking each other's questions. Perhaps we should compare notes before the next meeting, so we don't keep doing this. So still on the internal audit plan, I'm sure there's a very good reason for this. There's an item in the removed from the plan column on transformation, talent and inclusion that is no longer required. I was just wondering why that was no longer required.
So these audits were identified when we had our initial meetings with the departments about over a year ago now. And as we've explained previously, we've got a bit of a rolling plan, and where things are no longer a significant risk, we can take them out and do other things that are more important. Now, in these particular areas, they were flagged up because they were a bit concerned about how these things were working, particularly sickness absence because of COVID and how that was being reported. But having discussed it with the service partway through the year, they were confident that they actually had pretty good monitoring service processes in place, and they didn't feel that there would be much to add to what they already had in place. Bearing in mind, a lot of this runs through the IBC system, which is the Hampshire Partnership, and managers have been educated and briefed on how to do this, so especially due to COVID. So they felt that they really weren't high risk areas, and there were other things that were more significant that we should focus our resources on.
So we're confident that we don't have any issues with sickness absence, performance management, or... There
could always be issues, but it's how you, if you're monitoring those and picking them up and then reporting them back out to the departments, then that's sometimes all you can do, and that's what was happening. So we didn't need to tell them to do that because they were already doing it. They'd already gone through the process. In other councils, that communication may not be so good, and we would be recommending better communications, better training, or whatever. But compared with some of the other areas that we were looking at, they were not considered to be a problem. So we would have that discussion, and they would go through that with us before we would strike it out of the plan in all cases. Like I say, I can't say that you don't have a problem, but I don't think you have a significant problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Do we have any further questions on this report? I'm seeing shakes of the head, so are we happy to note? Excellent, thank you very much. Moving swiftly on, again, it's, I think, Moira to present item number 6, the internal audit plan.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, this is our proposed draft plan for 2022-23. Hopefully the report covers how we've gone about this, but basically we have a strategic plan where we identify key frequently occurring risks or areas where potential risks are, which we would like to cover over a 5-year period, and we refresh that every year, and that is actually shown in Appendix 1. So it's the sort of things you'd expect to find potentially in an audit plan at a local authority, and particularly London Borough. We then also have to take into account what the council's strategic risks are, and we've highlighted the strategic risks. I think it's the high medium risks I've summarised there, but obviously David's report that's following on has got the whole gamut of risks in there. And we've also identified what the council's values are as well. So we try to link everything together. But also very key to this is we discuss it with the departments and with their management teams to go through what things we think we should be looking at, what things they think we should be looking at, and we then come together with a plan. And as mentioned just now, we try to focus on a quarter in advance in a bit more detail. So we've got a pretty good idea of what we'll be doing in Q1, which is shown in Appendix 2. And we've got an outline of what we'd like to do in quarters 2 to 4, but on the proviso that we would have discussions with the services soon to firm up some more of these areas. Some of the audits are cyclical. We need to do them, for our own benefit, for our own assurance. Some things change, processes change, so we want to do those. New services come in, new priorities come in, new risks come in. And so it is a balanced approach based on all those factors. So it is very much a draft, but hopefully useful. And what I would say is that we would give you a more firm version of this at the next meeting, which hopefully you'll be able to cross-check, and that will be as firm as it can be for the year. But please accept that we will change things, but we will always bring those to your attention.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think just very briefly, I wanted to check in terms of the one or two mentions of fraud and kind of obviously the ongoing counter fraud activity and things like this. I think obviously in terms of what's been in the press, people are aware of the fraud through the various COVID grants. Is that something that's included or has sort of caused changes to the ongoing plan for the next year?
So I think if I may chair first, so obviously every 6 months Andy Hyatt comes to bring the fraud report to you, and what we've been reporting to there previously, and we'll report again in June, is that we've done a lot of work with colleagues who've been administering the grants within the local authority. I mean, that we're in the last throes of the last cycle of Omicron grants now. So what we've done is provided lots of pre and post payment assurance around the grant payments being made, but we're also having that effectively verified by the National Fraud Initiative. So they're doing data matching across the country to ensure that grant payments that local authorities make have been genuine and bona fide. We've had relatively low numbers of issues of grant fraud on the COVID grants to date, and cases where Andy's team have been working with colleagues to recover sums of money that were paid to some businesses through that. You'll know in the national media, a lot of the focus has actually been on the loans given to businesses by government, and perhaps some of the controls that weren't necessarily in place then. The National Audit Office, among others, have been critical of some of that as well. So it's something that we will make sure that's factored into the report that Andy brings back in June. But that's where the main focus of assurance work has been throughout the last 2 years with Andy's team.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. I'm not sure, do we have any questions on this?
We've taken the appendix as well.
Yes, I mean, yeah,
just looking, sorry, I can't remember. Looking at risk number 28, the Civic Campus Energy Centre. Does this have the potential to delay our return to our historic King Street home in
April 2023, or are officers happy that we will be able to move in as planned, or are there delays to the, or any further delays to the return?
Perhaps if I could ask David McNulty to come in that point, Councillor Carmel.
Hello, good evening, councillors. The programme is still very much that we will be handed the building back by April 2023. It's right that risk is obviously flagged given the kind of potential implications, but that's still very much the programme in terms of April 23. We're working through the kind of mitigations to make sure that we remain on course. But as I say, that still is very much the plan and what the contractors working towards and what we're gearing ourselves towards. But obviously, we'll inevitably keep members in the committee updated if there are any changes to that.
And just one other really anarchy problem. On page 467 of the report, item number...
I think, is that not the next report?
It is, yeah, it is. Sorry.
Is it? Sorry,
It's so eager to talk on item number 7.
Indeed.
Well, I'm assuming we don't have anything further on item number 6. So we're happy to well, there are 2 recommendations: that the committee review the draft strategic audit plan as set out in Appendix 1, and that review the annual audit plan as set out in Appendix 2. I think we've reviewed both. Are we all happy? Excellent. So now we can move on to item number 7. I think we'll get David Hughes to introduce first, and then we'll get straight back to Councillor Carmel's questions.
Thanks, Chair. I'll keep it brief so that Councillor Carmel can come back in with questions. So
you don't want to hear what it is, I assure you.
Sure.
Not because you should be worried about it. It's just an anarchy thing.
That's fine. Thank you. So as the committee will be aware, SLT Assurance review the corporate risk register on a regular basis, and that was done last at the beginning of March to bring the report to you today. Obviously, over the last few weeks, the Ukrainian situation has been something that's developed very significantly, and officers have been and are reviewing and assessing the impact of the situation to consider whether there are further entries that are required in the register. And there are a number of factors where this may come into place. There could be impact on residents, impact on businesses, impacts on the council in terms of fuel and other costs, impacts on contracts, impacts for the investments, for the pension committee, and so on. So that's something we will come back to you with a further report in June, which we set out there the work that's been done to assess the risks and to put mitigations in place as appropriate. In paragraphs 14 to 16, we identify where there are 4 risks that have had their ratings reduced since December, and 3 new risks have been added and 1 risk closed. So I'm happy then to pass over to the committee for any questions and any suggestions that the committee would like in terms of any sort of future reports in terms of deep dives on particular risks or any particular areas they'd like more information on.
Thank you very much. I think just very quickly, I know you've obviously mentioned the situation involving Ukraine and Russia. I think just for the purposes of the minutes, I know a few councillors have mentioned to me that they've had residents contact them to ask about the council's investment exposure to Russian companies or businesses doing work in Russia. Obviously, this affects a few areas of the council, including the pension fund. Just for the purposes of the minutes, I think just so councillors can be reassured and the public can be reassured that this is something we're looking into. I don't know if you're able to come back just in what work's being done on that at the moment.
Thank you. Yes, we've been looking into that very quickly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, it was a question that auditors also asked us in relation to potential post-balance sheet events on the pension fund investment. We have no direct holdings in any Russian stock or anything like that. We do, however, have a global bonds fund with the CIV, the London CIV, which is I'm trying to explain to members of the public what it is, but a group of London boroughs which undertake its investments to try to reduce sort of management costs, essentially. We have a global bonds fund which does include some Russian bonds. So the total value of that was 1.4 million. That's about 0.1% of our total fund, so a small element of our fund. However, clearly we're keen to take action in relation to those. It is a fund managed by PIMCO. We have been having discussions with the CIV around selling these assets. I mean, clearly at the moment, the market value of those has dropped significantly. In any case, and in many cases, we couldn't have actually sold them because they weren't, you can't sell them, there's no mechanism to sell them, but we think that that's sort of moving. So we are discussing that with the CIV. Given the pressures of all of the investors who feel similarly on this matter in that particular bonds fund, it's likely that we will be able to require them, the managers, to sell those. So we're just considering our options and discussing with them at the moment. But the answer is there is some not direct exposure, but indirect exposure in a global bonds fund, and we're looking to require the fund manager to sell those assets to remove our exposure to that. We will need to come back probably to the Pensions Fund Committee to do that once we understand more clearly the mechanisms to do that.
That's very helpful. That's I think, yeah, I thought it was going to be quite important just to have that in the minutes, that we are looking at that. In terms of other, well, I know Councillor Carmel did have one point that he was desperate to come in on.
I'm nowhere near desperate.
Okay, Councillor Kilablandy.
One of the big impacts that we are seeing before the Ukraine conflict that has increased is supply chain and inflation. I saw one mention in the actual risk register. I think it was item number 19 where inflation is mentioned. But can we just better understand what we're expecting and what we're already seeing in relation to inflation? Where are the pinch points? And are there any supply chain exposures that we also need to be worried or concerned about?
Thank you, Chair. Can I just clarify in relation to supply chain, you're talking about the inflation risks rather than the... Yeah. So a budgeting process for 22-23, so the financial year that we're just about to go into, includes inflationary uplifts on contracts. It did so, of course, in February, but based on information in autumn, and obviously inflation has increased significantly since then. So we have within the budget included provision for inflation. Having said that, a number of our contracts will have been entered into a while ago and will have inflationary mechanisms in the contract. So we know very clearly what the increases will be, because it will be CPI at a particular date or RPI at a particular date. And where we know that, we'll have factored that into the budget. Having said that, clearly inflation has outstripped even the OBR's expectations, and we did have concerns regarding that as we set the budget. So we included a significant contingency budget for inflation within 22-23 budget, which we will need to call as those requests come in. Having said that, a particular area of concern and pressure has, particularly in COVID, has been the social care market. There's also inflationary pressures because of the increase in national insurance that will be required by employers, particularly in the care sector. So we did put additional provisions to the social care budget for those costs as well. I think your question to me was sort of what have we seen come through? I think we'll start to see it as we have new contracts that come into place, and we'll need to be careful really that we're not sort of entering into them at the very sort of top really, where prices at the utmost. So we'll need to look at that going forwards. I think we are seeing it particularly, David's here, but in the sort of construction sector particularly. So some of our sort of capital schemes and things, we do need to just make sure that those schemes will remain viable with the new prices. So I think that's where we're probably seeing it the most, the pressures on the social care market, but that's probably more broadly even than just inflation, and then also on the sort of construction market.
submitted question, which is actually a related question to something that Councillor Reid mentioned earlier, which is cybersecurity, which I think is something we're all extremely concerned about at the moment. And I realise that we've gone through this in various parts of the meeting. But when I looked at the risk register, I was slightly concerned because it just didn't feel like there was much urgency in relation to putting forward some of the recommendations. I'm looking at risk number 4, and there's also a mention of cybersecurity at risk number 3. And there was sort of talk of these things happening in March and April. I just wanted to get a sense of, have those things happened, and are we 100% confident that we are managing information securely in this incredibly difficult time?
So if I may, Chair, that's a very helpful question. So on risk 3, the actions that are planned around April are around the business continuity arrangements and disaster recovery arrangements that sit behind the work that services do. So if there were to be a sort of a successful attack, that what would be in place to make sure that those services could continue. So that work began in the autumn, as the report says, and services have been reviewing and updating their business continuity plans and ensuring that those are robust and in place. So that reporting back to SLT is to give assurance that work has been done. But again, we can share a summary of that with the committee when we come to the next meeting.
And then the final question, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say, in terms of the risk 4 and the reference to sort of the information security manager, and that talked about March and April, which I think you referred to. Just to be very clear, it's not that we've been without an information sort of security manager or any sort of those arrangements, but they've been filled on an interim basis whilst the restructure was being undertaken, and therefore we're now following this restructure, a new operating model. We're undertaking the permanent recruitment, but that's not to say that there wasn't that resource in place. It was just on an interim basis.
And then this is not strictly related to risk, but it does feel like an important thing to raise. We're likely to have staff who are impacted indirectly by the Ukraine and Russia conflict, either Russian staff or Ukrainian staff. How are we supporting those staff during this incredibly difficult time?
So I'm happy to pick that up, Chair, if Sharon would like to come in as well. So I know that at SLT, that's a matter for regular discussion to make sure that there's appropriate support through HR in place for all colleagues who might be affected by the situation in Ukraine. And that's something that so heads of service and managers are being asked to ensure they're looking out for those staff to ensure that they have appropriate support and that their well-being is looked after. But if Sharon would like to come in and add to that.
Yes, Chair, Sharon Lee, I'm Interim Chief Executive. This is an item now that's on every SLT agenda. Obviously, looking out for our staff is our #1 priority. And even before the conflict started, we were looking to support our staff, as we are now looking to support any refugees that we will welcome into the borough. So it is a top priority for us, Chair. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's very, very helpful. I'm not sure. Do we have any other questions? Councillor Carmel has his hand up.
Just a follow-on from an answer that was given earlier, and just by background, committee members may remember at the last meeting that I raised the subject of the difference between interest we were paying on loans and the interest we were receiving. And I raised the subject of the elephant in the room, which was inflation, for which I was told that there will always be some erosion. You said that there was significant contingency in the budget for inflation. In percentage terms, could you give me some ideas, considering what the latest ABR forecasts are for inflation, what you consider significant contingencies and what the OBR currently estimate inflation is to be?
Yeah, I mean, the contingencies is sort of round sums really in terms of millions, but it would be I'm trying to think what it would be in percentages. It's not significant in terms of a large percentage. It would be a couple of percent essentially that we would have on the contracted sums. The latest potential things is up to 8% almost. So you know, they could be large amounts. As I say, I think in most cases, because we've already entered into contracts where this particular inflationary figure has already been agreed, we shouldn't be seeing sort of those figures hit in 22, 23, but we'll see them again in future years. So definitely something we'll need to continue to put into the MTFS, because we would generally agree uplifts based on a figure that's passed, if you're exactly right. So it's not to say that's not a risk for the council, and we will need to factor that into the next year's budget for 23-24, which of course we start now. But for 22-23, I'm relatively satisfied that we've got a cushion, a significant cushion within the budget to enable us to deal with anything that comes up. Because of course, even though something may be contractual, if a contractor is at risk of failure, there may be a need to still revisit that conversation with them. So it's not to say it's totally without risks, that we've already got those sort of agreed inflationary provisions within the budget.
Well, and of course, just as a comment, with increased inflation, there's also increased pressure on staff wages, which is another significant factor that will have to be borne in mind. And as one who still bears the scars of having been on the Greater London Employment Forum and the Greater London Provincial Council, I know just how robust those discussions can be. But anyway, back to my little thing that I said was not particularly interesting. Two things on page 467 in item number 31. The first at point 4 is, please can somebody tell me under mitigations what first city brackets artificial close brackets tree in Hammersmith installed, and why is this a mitigation?
So I don't know, Chair, if Sharon's able to pick up on that, or whether we come back with a response on that.
Chair, it's it's a tree that helps to clean the air, but it's not a real tree. It's a mechanical one. So it helps to reduce pollution. And it doesn't, I can honestly say it doesn't look as good as a real tree, but it does a marvellous job, apparently. And we can send Councillor Carmel the details of it, because I'm sure I'm not being terribly scientific in my description, but that's what it's about.
If I was to be very cynical, I am incredibly sceptical of the scientific claims made by the manufacturers of these things. I don't think they are anywhere near as effective as they like to pretend they are. There's a lot. I genuinely do think this is something the council and other councils need to be careful of. I think these things there's been a lot of questioning about the claims being made as to how effective they are, and I don't know if they're necessarily as good as they say they are at mitigating, air, or sorry, it's cleaning the air. I do think it's something we do need to look at as a council as to whether the claims stack up, because I think a few environmental groups are beginning to question quite how realistic the claims being made are by the manufacturers of these things.
And if I could just come back on it after that explanation, I'd love to see more information on this. But now that you have raised that, I also recall reading something where one of the environmental groups did what's called a whole life cycle review of the costs of manufacturing and installing the tree. And I think they came to the conclusion that the amount of pollution that was caused in the manufacture, installation and maintenance of the tree was 5 times greater than even the manufacturer's claimed improvement in air quality. But I'll leave that be, and I will look forward to reading that. The other one is very particularly minor. that on mitigation 2, much as the Creek would love to be upgraded to the rank of Countess, I think it's actually called Counters Creek.
Apologies. We'll correct that.
Thank you very much. I do think, just in terms, going back quickly to the climate change risk, although it's possibly just my geeky level of interest in these kind of sort of artificial trees and other claims, but I think in general, with regards to the climate emergency and climate change, I don't know if that is something to look at with regards to the risk register. I think there is an issue of, I think possibly, there's a lot of organisations, and obviously climate change is a huge issue for absolutely everybody going, whether it's local authorities, private companies, or whoever else. And I think there does need to be a bit of a dose of scepticism as to some of the claims made by what appear to be quite glossy and exciting solutions to the problems. And it's whether it is a risk from our point of view, making sure that we are properly looking into solutions. Are they realistic and actually useful, or is this a little bit of greenwash? Because I think that is going to be an issue going forward. I mean, I think for those of us in the pension committee, it's always interesting interviewing fund managers and trying to guess quite how realistic they're being in their claims of being, environmentally conscious. But I think it's also something we need to be quite careful of as well, because I think residents, as they become more aware of these issues, will begin to kind of haul the council over the coals as to whether our response to the climate emergency is.
We've got something greener than coal.
Well, yes, hold over the artificial city trees. I don't know if that's equally as applicable.
To that point, I would say that they're an innovative solution, and we shouldn't be scared to back innovation where it's required. And my understanding of this organisation is that they are a local organisation. So again, this is the kind of innovation that in 5-10 years could have a radical could make a radical difference to the quality of air pollution in the cities. And having backed the net zero motion, things I'm very proud about this council is our ability to back technology and not being scared to innovate as well. So I think we need to continue to be skeptical, but also not be scared to innovate as well. And I would just add that I think our climate plan is actually one of the best in the country. So I think it's important that we mark that, and we take note of the good steps that the council is taking in relation to declaring climate emergency and taking real action, which is so important.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. I think I'm just, in terms of the kind of reputational risk of the council, it's just make sure that we're doing the right things in the right way and aren't being sort of lured by easy options, because I think this is going to be probably the most difficult thing that we're going to be doing as a council over over the foreseeable near, medium and long-term future. On that note, I don't know if there's any other questions or if we're happy to note the report. I think we are happy to note, in which case the final thing is that the date of the next meeting is the 21st of June. But I think Councillor Rhea said this is my kind of goodbye to her, because this is my final meeting, and the Pensions Committee was my final meeting until we found out today that it might not be my final meeting because we might be having another Pensions Committee. But I think I just want to thank all the officers for their work over the years, especially Emily and David Hughes, also David Abbott as well, who has been an enormous support behind the scenes, making sure that the committee runs smoothly. I think some of us who've been here for a while might remember the epic 3.5-hour meetings of 6 or 7 years ago. The fact that we're finished by 8:30 is a kind of very welcome change. But yes, thank you very much, everybody. And it's been a pleasure to be chair of the committee. And I wish everybody a good evening.
Thank you, Chair.
And thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.